Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay. Well, of course, everyone has heard of Charles Darwin, and not so many people have heard of Alfred Russel Wallace. But what I'm going to talk about today is actually, unfortunately, very controversial, because basically all publications and talks and documentaries about Wallace are told from a particular perspective, not one of the historian, but rather of sort of the Wallace fans, the Wallace admirers. And Wallace was a very admirable person. But as you can see from this cartoon from 2009, when the Darwin celebrations were so massive, hundreds of events going on around the world, well, one cartoonist put Wallace out on the limb back then. Well, what about me? Right? Well, and this is the problem that I want to address, which is that a picture or an image of Wallace has arisen in the last 40 years, which puts Wallace as a sort of victim or underdog figure for whom we feel sorry and we identify with him. And it turns out, I've been thinking recently, as I'm actually being attacked by these Wallace fans for what they think attacking their hero. But it's interesting that there are actually a lot of figures like this. So, for example, you might remember The Longitude, which was a best-selling book and TV documentaries a few years ago, in which John Harrison is the suppressed working-class genius, and Neville Maskelyne is using all of his connections and so forth to better himself. Then, of course, there's Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole, another one of the sort of the wealthy person getting all the credit, and the obscure figure who has also a large following trying to bring back her reputation. I don't know whether the merits of these cases, but it's a similar kind of story, right? It's same with Watson and Crick versus Rosalind Franklin. Many people think Rosalind Franklin's been swept under the carpet of history by the sort of heroes, Watson and Crick, who got the Nobel Prize, and Franklin didn't. Well, so this is what we're left with, is a sort of Wallace martyr. But this is not the historical Wallace, who is my goal as a historian. So let's start off with trying to set the record straight about Wallace. So we start off with Wallace, who is represented as a working-class scientist who's from the complete opposite end of the social spectrum from the rich Darwin. Well, Darwin was incredibly rich and never had to work a day in his life. That's true. But what about Wallace? Was Wallace really as hard off as they say? Well, these are Wallace's parents, who, look, they're basically straight out of a Jane Austen novel. Wallace's father was a gentleman. That means he had enough money not to work. And on Wallace's birth certificate, he's listed gentleman, and so forth. But, of course, as many of you will know, he lost most of the money, so the family did become rather poor. Wallace was born in this house, not that far away, near Usk, and I'll just mention briefly, a lot of people like to claim that Wallace is Welsh, which is fine, but Wallace's parents were English, and they soon moved back to England, and Wallace always called himself English, so I'm not so sure how good that claim is, but fair enough. Anyway, so there's his house. It's actually quite a nice house. It's not the mansion that the Darwins lived in, but it's not a peasant's hut. He's not born in a miner's house or something like that. This is the school that he went to when they moved to Hartford Free Grammar School. In other words, Wallace was a public schoolboy, not the way he's usually represented. The curriculum identical to Darwin's at Shrewsbury Free Grammar School. This was a school which advertised itself as a school for the sons of gentlemen. There were other schools in Hartford for the poor. So Wallace had an excellent education. Next, it's always said that Wallace was forced to leave school early at only the age of 14 because the family money ran out. Well, this is simply a myth. There is no evidence for that at all. I don't know where it came from, but once it gets out there, it gets repeated again and again. He left at the normal leaving age for those not going to university. It was 14. He completed school. So because he had that fine education, he had some career prospects in mind. Of course, the family money, there was no way he could go to university. He didn't have a scholarship, there was no money. So it was out into the working world. And as you've already heard, surveyor was his first profession, which got him out into the countryside, and that's where his interest in natural history and science really began. And then he, after a brief spell as a watch repairman, which he didn't like, he became a teacher at the collegiate school in Leicester. Now, this is where you see that the fine education paid off. He was qualified to become a teacher because of his background. He knew Latin and so forth. So he spent his time there, but he had lots of free time in which he did a lot of reading and read, most importantly, I think, this book, Vestiges of Creation, which was a sort of early Victorian evolutionary potboiler that talked about the entire cosmos evolving and so forth. And Wallace, who was open to radical new ideas, accepted this. He accepted very early on that some kind of evolution occurs, or has occurred in the history of life. And he met this young man, Henry Walter Bates, who taught Wallace how to collect beetles and insects, and they became very good friends. And eventually, Wallace came up with the idea that since there were no jobs in science in those days, in universities or industry, they could make a living by becoming specimen collectors. So they traveled, because the natural history obsession in the Victorian times is hard to overestimate. There was a huge demand for dead things from all over the world, dead birds, dead insects, and so forth. Not just for institutions like this is the British Museum, but also for individuals. Many, many people collected things in their own cabinets. So, for example, you might collect butterflies, and you would pay quite a lot to get that one beautiful specimen you're missing in the series of your, say, Costa Rican butterflies or whatever it might be. So Wallace and Bates went out to make a living as freelance collectors, fulfilling this demand. Now, it's usually said that Wallace and Bates set out on the Amazon not really just for the sort of low idea of getting money and collecting commercially, but with the noble idea of going on a quest to solve the origin of species. Well, that's a great story, but unfortunately the evidence for that is actually unfounded. There's only one sentence that we used to base that story on. In fact, Wallace himself never told the story in that way, even though every book and documentary will tell you that he went out to solve the origin of species problem. But Wallace, what did he actually say in the many times he recounted this story? I went out to be a collector. And that's what he actually did. He spent 4 years collecting, then he discovered many new species, and on his way home, tragedy struck. The ship caught fire in the middle of the Atlantic and burned down to the waterline. Wallace's collection, his notes and drawings, all lost. Well, fortunately, he and the crew survived. He made it back to England, and after a short time, fattened up a bit, as you can see in this photograph. He's looking quite plump, and ready to set out on another expedition. Now, following on the popularity of his first expedition being a quest to solve the mystery of mysteries, the origin of species, many writers say that his next one was also for that reason. But again, there's simply no evidence for that. He went out to be a commercial collector again, set sail, or rather set off on a steamship from the port of Southampton here in 1850. This is what it looked like. This is rather different from what we have nowadays when you go to Heathrow for a long journey. It was rather more genteel. Now, Wallace had done some careful networking to prepare for this expedition, and he got government funding to pay for a first-class ticket on the P&O steamer to Singapore. The equivalent today would be something like a first-class flight to Singapore, which would set you back, I don't know, about £5,000 or £6,000. It was a very expensive ticket. He never could have afforded this without government assistance. So he made it out to Singapore in April 1854 and started on the greatest adventure of his life, and that would change everything, and not just for Wallace, but for the rest of us. This is the map that he eventually published in his book. The region that was then sometimes called the Malay Archipelago. Now we usually say Southeast Asia. And starting from here in Singapore, and these black lines represent his many journeys throughout the islands, in which he made these fantastic collections. These are just a tiny fraction of the many things, well, Wallace killed, let's put it that way. I mean, he was a hunter. He was a collector. He killed things. He preserved them. He sent them back, and they were sold to him. And he discovered hundreds of species of birds, mostly insects. He had an army of collectors who helped increase the size of his collection up to 125,000 specimens. And then mammals as well. And I like to put this big picture of shells up there because shells are not very sexy and they tend to be forgotten. But they collected shells as well. That was another part of the commercial collecting sorts of animals. Now, this is one of Wallace's most famous stories of how this is from his book, how a giant python was found in the rafters of his hut. And he called his servants to come in and help, and when they saw it, they ran out. So they had to get a local man to come, and this is slightly dramatized, but drag this giant python out of the hut, which he did by poking it with a stick until it uncoiled, grabbed the tail, and ran out, so that it didn't have time to wrap around anything. And then outside, they basically killed it. That was it. Now, that's a very plausible story. It's exciting enough to have been illustrated in his book, but at least he's honest. Whereas another naturalist, an exact contemporary of Wallace in the same region, who published his book in the same year, was American naturalist Albert Bickmore. He described an encounter also with a giant python, but in his account, he describes how the snake got loose on board the ship and how he had a life and death battle with this python, which lasted 15 minutes while the snake was constantly biting and trying to get him. And he, poor man, armed only with an axe, managed to slay the snake in the end. That's a tall tale, not at all like Wallace's. Well, Wallace moved on from Singapore and Malacca to the great island of Borneo, and particularly this pink region here, which was the province of Sarawak, then ruled by the eccentric Englishman and the so-called White Raja of Sarawak, Sir James Brooke. Wallace was under his care and protection and began the whole collecting enterprise again. But while in Sarawak, it rained very heavily for quite a long time. He was housebound, and as he often did, he spent his time reading and thinking about evolution in species. And he wrote this, what is now his second most famous paper, the Sarawak Law Paper. Well, all writers and documentaries will tell you that this paper is where Wallace boldly declared his belief in evolution and laid out, basically, a theory of evolution, just missing natural selection. This is his sort of conclusion statement. Every species has come into existence, coincident both in space and time with a pre-existing closely allied species. Well, there's one problem with this generalization, which is the paper doesn't mention evolution at all. I mean, it's not that it doesn't have the word. He nowhere says that new species actually come from earlier ones. Instead, he says they are somehow formed or created in the same place where an earlier one existed. Now, that's not the same thing. And it's somewhat mysterious. Why did Wallace write it in this vague way? We know he believed in evolution privately at this time, but he didn't say so openly. Well, a letter which we recently found to Sir James Brooke, which is published in our book, explains why. Wallace sent an offprint of this to Sir James and a letter, which are lost. But we have Sir James's reply, in which he says, well, it's curious what you say, that your article has been sent out to test the waters on a curious subject. And I'm sorry to hear about the bigotry and prejudice that you mention on this topic. So clearly, Wallace was not ready to come out of the closet as an evolutionist. And guess what? That explains something else. People have always said, well, why didn't Darwin get it when he read Wallace's paper? Well, this is Darwin's own copy. I just consulted this a few days ago in Cambridge. And in the back are Darwin's notes on Wallace's paper. Darwin very clearly read the paper as, because it's vague, can be read in a couple of different ways, equally plausibly. Darwin read it as a creationist account. He says 3 times in his notes here, it's all creation for him. If one were to replace creation with reproduction, I would agree with him. That's why Darwin didn't get it, because it was intentionally vague. So we have this idea of these 2 men on a parallel course, and the idea that there was any suspicion on Darwin's side that Wallace might be encroaching simply isn't true. Well, the next question is, well, who wrote first, and how did they get in touch? For many years, it's been believed that Wallace initiated contact between the 2 men, because we have a mention of Wallace in a letter to his agent saying that I'm sending a duck from the island of Lombok, and here are some Lombok ducks. I was on a little trip in Wallace's footsteps last year. They're kind of a distinctive breed. They walk very upright like a penguin. They don't waddle like a normal duck. They sort of run. Anyway, so cute, very cute little ducks. So Wallace sent the skin of one of these to Darwin, and that was what we thought the first contact. But it turns out that that was jumping the gun. In fact, Darwin wrote to Wallace and about 30 other people around the world asking for domestic poultry skins. So Wallace's letter was a reply. It wasn't the first letter in their correspondence. Now, we have Wallace's name on this list that Darwin sent out letters to, but not the letter itself. But fortunately, we have 3 others to men on that list. And they're basically all identical. I mean, if you wrote 30 letters to 30 strangers asking for the same thing, your wording is very similar. And this is what he says. At the very start of the letter, he explains why he's doing this. I have for many years been working on the perplexed subject of the origin of varieties and species, and for this purpose, I am endeavoring to study the effects of domestication. In other words, Darwin told Wallace in the first sentences of the first letter he ever wrote to Wallace, I'm working on evolution. Now, that must have really interested Wallace, who was very interested in this topic. We know from his private notebooks he was speculating on this topic. Now to have but was afraid to say it in print, and in several articles he gets kind of close to the topic, but never mentions his own views that he believes in evolution. So this must have been very good news to Wallace, and thus initiated a correspondence between them. Well, Wallace moved on from Borneo, where we just were, through all these islands, ended up here in the Molucca Islands, which are in reach of New Guinea. And New Guinea is where one finds the magnificent birds of paradise, some of the most beautiful birds in the world, and some of the most valuable. So Wallace was there to kill them, lots of them, and sell them, preserve them, and so forth. That is his job as a specimen collector. Well, he ends up on the Dutch island of Ternate, which was the furthest point you could reach on the Dutch steamer system. In fact, that map is a map of the Dutch steamers showing where they went. And Ternate was the furthest point you could get. And there were ships that sometimes went out to New Guinea. Well, there, in the midst of a tropical fever, sweating almost to death, Wallace has the great epiphany of his life, a eureka moment, as he later described it. Aha! He had an idea how evolution works, something new, very different from what he'd thought before. When his fever ended, he got up and he wrote an essay with his new ideas. What did he do with that essay? Well, that's been the subject of much debate. Let me just give you the gist of his essay, because, again, much has been said about it over the years, but a very careful reading, a historical reading, using only contemporary sources, shows that his theory is not the same as we've traditionally thought it to be. So the title was On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. Varieties are sort of like subspecies, the local version of a particular species, one that's a different color. So his essay argues that there is a struggle for existence in nature. This is not original to Wallace. This was found in Malthus and Lyell and many other writers. So as the environment changes, a species could become unsuited to its environment and therefore go extinct. This is also not new to Wallace. But, Wallace said, a variety of that species might happen to be already, before, better suited to that environment and so survive. Okay, but what sparked this breakthrough? Well, the traditional theories are, well, simply that, as he said in later years, he told the story very often, always a little bit differently, that he remembered Malthus's book. That's possible, but he doesn't mention Malthus in his essay, so we can't really know if that's true. The most popular one is probably that it was the site of another race of human beings on the nearby island of Gololo, the so-called Alfuros, who were more Papuan than Malay. And the other one is that, well, he was just thinking about dying because he was lying there in fever, and so the idea of being naturally selected and dying somehow occurred to him. But these are all retrospective and speculative. The only contemporary evidence of any kind that survives by Wallace in connection to this moment and to what he may have been thinking about is a mention in this letter in which he talks about tiger beetles and different islands always being a different color and matching their background on that different island. And he says then, such facts as these puzzled me for a long time, but I have lately worked out a theory which accounts for them naturally. Wow. And this letter was written 2 weeks after the event. We don't have anything else referring to that event for another 10 or 15 years. So that's it. So that may have been what prompted him. In any case, this concept of protective coloration is mentioned twice in his essay. So I'll reconstruct Wallace's original theory of evolution using some illustrations here. So bear with me. Just imagine that this, I just pulled these off the internet, but just imagine that this beetle perfectly matches the background, okay? If you imagine that, then Wallace's theory can be made clear with some images. So this is the species, the parent species, which perfectly matches the background, but there are lots of daughter varieties. And for Wallace, varieties are constantly being born. They're constantly appearing. One example of a variety is albinos. They just appear at once, not gradually. They appear fully formed from parents that are differently colored. So he thinks that there are always varieties of different colors around, and perhaps they're being eaten by birds at a differential rate. Now, he says, following Lyell, imagine the environment gradually changes. Then the parent species is no longer so well camouflaged and goes extinct. And maybe then there is, in effect, competition between the daughter varieties too. And they all go too. And what we're left with is only one of the daughter varieties. It has replaced the parent species. And thus, as he said, the variety would now have replaced the species. And such a variety could not return to the original form, for that form is an inferior one. Remember the brown one. It can't revert back and become brown again. That's what Wallace's theory originally meant. Hence its title, The Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely. You simply have to reiterate this process on. And this was his original idea of how evolution by natural selection occurred. It's this Wallace's version of natural selection. Is it the same as Darwin's theory? No. No, it's not. Even though Darwin himself said, it's identical to my theory. It's not. If you read it very carefully, there are differences, and this is one of the biggest ones. The varieties for Darwin are formed by tiny, tiny differences in individuals being selected by nature over a very long period of time and gradually could form a variety. But for Wallace, that happened at once. So for Wallace, evolution was more of a jump, 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 whereas for Darwin, it's tiny, tiny increments that are almost invisibly small. Okay, so Wallace has written this brilliant essay. What does he do with it? He doesn't send it for publication. This has always been a big mystery. Why didn't he send it for publication, people say? He would have been famous and so forth. He must have known this. Well, I don't know if he must have known that or not. But surely it's not a coincidence that this was the first document Wallace had ever written for others to read that overtly argued for evolution and openly said that he believed in evolution. The first one, and the only one he did not send straight off for publication. I don't think that can be a coincidence. Now, much later, he said this, I had the idea of working it out so far as I was able when I returned home. That may have been what he originally planned, but something happened that changed his mind. He received this, a letter from Darwin, which said, praised his Sarawak paper again and told Wallace something really exciting. The great geologist, Wallace's hero, Sir Charles Lyell, really liked your Sarawak paper too. This was the most flattering letter Wallace had ever received. And he gave him an idea. Mr. Darwin, who is also an evolutionist like me, and my hero approve of my earlier work. If they were impressed by that, maybe they would be impressed by my new one. Maybe I could even convince Sir Charles that evolution is not false but true, using his own theories, his own principles. This was what Wallace's essay was aimed at doing, really. And so he sent his essay off to Darwin. One of the greatest ironies in history, right? This is how the event was depicted in an oil painting in 1959. There's Darwin reading Wallace's paper. This is Sir Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker. They're painted in for, that's artistic license. They weren't really there, but anyway, he had to fill the background. So look at the way Darwin is depicted. Sort of, intrigued. Yes? Well, this story has evolved, as all stories do, over time. Now we get a more pained Darwin. This is 2001, having a bit of stomach upset as he reads this. And 2009, actually sort of in an actual fit of, oh my God! This is an incredibly dramatic, painful moment, a way it is represented by the filmmakers, and in documentaries, and on it goes. So instead of it being one of, how curious, it has become devastating for Darwin. Okay, now one of the biggest mysteries. When did Wallace's letter actually arrive at Darwin's down house? And did he lie about its receipt? This has been the basis for a small conspiracy industry. One writer said, this is the hardest story in science, and one day it is going to blow up. In other words, you're going to figure out that Darwin was a liar and a cheat. David Quammen says, it's a riddle that science historians have never cracked, and at its core is the issue of who deserves credit for one of the greatest scientific achievements in history. And most extreme of all, conspiracy theorist Roy Davies wrote, at the heart of that famous historical event lies a deliberate and iniquitous case of intellectual theft, deceit, and lies perpetuated by Charles Darwin. Well, few writers are quite that extreme, but there was something that didn't quite make sense, a sort of gap. And so there were conspiracy theories to fill that gap. Let me explain this gap. Wallace's essay is signed Ternate, February 1858. And in later years, he recollected, I sent it by the next post to Mr. Darwin. Well, we know there was only one mail steamer per month on that remote island. So it couldn't be just any old day. It was only one day per month, and we know when the ships were there. So another letter was sent home by Wallace on this 9th of March, and arrived on the 3rd of June. But Darwin said he got Wallace's on the 18th of June. Aha. What's going on? Right? If they're both sent on the same day, they must arrive on the same day. There are no two routes or anything like that. There's only one way. So what's the solution to this letter going from Ternate all the way across the world by steamship? Well, this was considered the smoking gun. This is the letter that does survive by Wallace to a friend, and its postmarks show when it came. Well, the problem with this was actually quite simple. All along, everyone assumed that the letter to Darwin was sent on the same day as this. But without any evidence, the letter itself is lost. We don't have it. And why? Was that a mistaken assumption? Let me go back to that. Because of this letter. The only thing we know about that lost letter is that Wallace sent it in reply to this. So he couldn't have posted a letter before this. Well, it turns out, if you look at all of Wallace's correspondence from his expedition, he never sent a letter on the same steamer as the one he was replying to. The turnaround time was, I guess, too short. It was always by the subsequent or even a later steamer that he sent replies. So we shouldn't be looking at the same steamer on which Darwin's letter arrived, but the following one. So that's what I did. And so I checked all the postal records for the next steamer, and guess what? The steamer that left that day, you can work through all the postal records and reconstruct it, and guess what? It arrived in London on the 17th of June, and at Down House on exactly the day Darwin said he received it. I think mystery solved. It was just a silly mistake that we shouldn't have made in the first place. Anyway, so what happened next? Darwin sends Wallace's essay off to Lyell the same day, as Wallace had requested. Whoops. And the other conspiracy is that Darwin may have filched bits from the essay, borrowed things, plagiarized, or something like that. There's really not much I can say about that apart from, no, there's no evidence for this whatsoever, even though it just keeps cropping up over and over again. Well, Lyell and Hooker decided that Wallace's essay was brilliant and should be immediately read, but they wouldn't do so without something from Darwin, who felt a bit uncomfortable by this, because he was afraid that his gentlemanly honor might be infringed. But he put it in the hands of his friends, and that sort of made him have a clear conscience. And they decided to read papers by both men. Well, was that acceptable? Was it unfair to Wallace? Well, most books and documentaries will tell you that this was wrong. This was very wrong. Maybe even illegal, because they didn't have Wallace's explicit permission or consent. Well, the problem with that is the way things would be today. But that is not the way things were in the 1850s. In the 1850s, letters and Documents written by far-flung naturalists were published in scientific journals every week without their knowledge, including Darwin. During the voyage of the Beagle, his letters were read by his former professor at Cambridge and printed as a pamphlet without his knowledge. Equally, professor of geology read others at the Geological Society of London, and those were published in periodicals without Darwin's knowledge. It was common practice. It would only be not okay if you wrote not to be published or private, which they sometimes did. Wallace sometimes did that too. But he didn't do that for this one. So finally, what did Wallace actually say when he found out that his wonderful essay had been read together with Darwin's? Well, this is what he wrote to his own mother. I have received letters from Mr. Darwin and Dr. Hooker, two of the most eminent naturalists in England, which has highly gratified me. I sent Mr. Darwin an essay on a subject in which he is now writing a great work. He showed it to Dr. Hooker and Sir Charles Lyell, who thought so highly of it that they immediately read it before the Linnaean Society. This ensures me the acquaintance and assistance of these eminent men on my return home. Where's the offense? Where's the without my consent? They thought so highly of it, they had it immediately read, because that was common practice. Okay, so the big question is, they both published the theory of evolution by natural selection simultaneously. They are the co-founders, the co-discoverers. Why don't they have co-credit, or, well, they do have co-credit. Why don't they have co-fame, co-recognition? Why isn't Wallace as famous as Darwin? This is, has something sinister happened to sweep Wallace under the carpet? Well, that's the kind of picture you will get from most popular descriptions, like Bill Bailey's series on BBC recently. I mean, this tells it all, right? Bill Bailey's Jungle Hero. This is not a historical approach. It was known as a joint theory for decades, he says. What went wrong? Well, what went wrong is that's completely untrue. It was never known as the joint theory. Wallace was robbed, he says. It should have been Wallace and not Darwin. The reason Darwin is so much more famous is simply this, that the year after their joint papers were read, which basically did nothing, their papers started no revolution, it simply established their joint credit and priority for a new idea, but it did nothing else. Darwin's Origin of Species was the result of 20 years of research and experiment and clever argumentation and so forth. It was this one book, within the space of about 10 or 15 years, which convinced the international scientific community that evolution is a fact, and it has never since then been scientifically disputed. And that's a big deal for one book to do, for an extremely controversial and uncongenial theory. And all of those people attributed their conversion to Darwin. And it was the controversy over this book, the notoriety of this book, that made Darwin super famous overnight. And he stayed that way. That is why Darwin is well known, because Darwin did the work. He wrote the book that started this scientific revolution. Wallace himself was always grotesquely modest, far more modest than he should have been, but that's one of the amiable parts of his character. So when Darwin scolded him once for saying, look, you're always calling it my theory and never our theory, but it's just as much yours as mine. And this is what Wallace wrote back. As to the theory itself, I shall always maintain it to be actually yours and yours only. You had worked it out in details I had never thought of. Years before I had a ray of light on the subject, my paper would never have convinced anybody or been noticed as more than an ingenious speculation, whereas your book has revolutionized the study of natural history and carried away captive the best men of the present age. All the merit I claim is having been the means of inducing you to write and publish at once. Well, I think that's going a bit far, but Wallace did publish his main book on evolution after Darwin's death and titled it Darwinism. And it's, I would say, that next to The Origin of Species, the greatest book ever written on how we know evolution is true, even today. It's a fantastic overview of the evidence of various kinds. So what's happened to Wallace? Well, the more I've been working on Wallace and the more I'm being attacked by Wallace fans, the more I realize that there's something interesting going on in the way these stories are told. So it's a kind of Wallace hagiography that's been going on since the 1970s. And I've boiled it down into these points of sort of the points of the Wallace faith, which are basically these, that Wallace was hugely disadvantaged, he was cheated or wronged in some way, He was hard done by. He's been forgotten because of his low birth status, wealth, something like that. But he had superlative achievements. He was the greatest collector of the 19th century, it's always said now. He was the greatest evolutionist. They argue that his theory was actually much better than Darwin's, and Darwin made lots of mistakes. Wallace was the father of biogeography. He wasn't a racist like Darwin. Every book will tell you this. Darwin's a bit of a racist. Well, yeah, all Victorians were racists. And they say, but Wallace wasn't. And then, of course, they say that Wallace was the most famous scientist in the world when he died. And ever since then, something has happened. So therefore, bottom line, his reputation must be restored. We must right this wrong. This is the view. Well, I could refute all of those points if I had time, but just think about this one that he's forgotten because of his humble background. But what about all these other figures? David Livingstone, Michael Faraday, William Whewell, Richard Owen, Spencer, Huxley, even Dickens, all come from humble or humbler backgrounds than Wallace. And that didn't have anything to do with their reputations. Wallace's, I think, has more to do with the fact that after he discovered natural selection, after he published many important scientific works, his interests vastly spread out into other areas. And for the last decades of his life, he wasn't primarily a scientist. He was a social activist and many other things. And some of these things probably hurt his reputation. No, they did. So, for example, he was involved in a lot of wacky Victorian movements. The anti-vaccination movement. He never tired of praising phrenology, even after everyone else had dropped it. Wallace never gave up on anything once he believed in it, including mesmerism and spiritualism. Wallace was very vocal about his belief. These are photographs of Wallace with ghosts. I don't remember which ghost this is. This one is supposed to be his mother. And Wallace said, the curious thing is that this apparition doesn't actually look like my mother, which shows you what? That spirits kind of change their appearance after they die. I'm sometimes shocked at Wallace for going quite so far with these things. In his autobiography, he offers an example to show the readers how solid the foundation for spiritualism is. He investigated the room where a seance was about to take place. There were no hidden passages or trapdoors or anything. The medium was put in a little alcove and a curtain was drawn. She was bound up with rope or ribbon or something. She was a lady, so it was probably silk ribbon. Anyway, she's bound up and the lights go out, they hold hands. And guess what happens? In the pale flicker of whatever light is available, a ghostly hand comes through the curtain holding a note. The note is retrieved and Wallace says, this note was not in the handwriting of the medium. Therefore, it was written by a spirit. I don't know what to say about this. I'm shocked every time I read that. Wallace, come on. There are a lot of other possible explanations. You know, she could have changed the handwriting. She could have had it in her pocket before. You know, nope, it was a spirit. So he believed very firmly. I think, sadly, these things damaged his well-deserved scientific reputation. But those are other issues. They're not the same, I think, as his pursuit of an understanding for how life on Earth has changed and how it works. So I hope the image of a Wallace versus Darwin story will fade away with time, and that we'll simply have one of Wallace, Darwin, and lots of other figures who contributed to the gradual growth of modern science, which is why I'll end on the note that Wallace and Darwin, friends now and always. Thanks very much. Now, I understand we have 20 minutes for questions. And there are microphones circulating. Perhaps this gentleman here is closest to a microphone. And then you. Yes? Yes, please?
How many species are named for Wallace?
Oh, gosh, that I don't know off the top of my head, but many. There's a list on the Wallace Fund website, which shows all of those currently known. We're still finding more and more that were in the past named after Wallace, but many, yeah. And some are known So, for example, there's Wallace's flying frog discovered in Borneo, which the scientific name isn't actually named after Wallace. Similarly, Wallace discovered the biggest bee in the world, 1.5 inches long, and so it's known as Wallace's giant bee, but the scientific name isn't actually named after Wallace. So maybe here next. And next, yeah, okay.
I also know Wallace from the Wallace line, which seems to indicate that he analysed his data, he didn't just collect. Is that a fair assessment of his scientific achievements?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The Wallace line, I didn't have time to mention all of the things Wallace did in his voyage, but if I go back to the map, the Wallace line was named after Wallace by Huxley, and it basically goes between the islands of Bali and Lombok, and up past Sulawesi and so forth. Basically what it means is that Wallace discovered that Australian things are over here and Asian things are over here. Well, actually, this was very old knowledge. What Wallace discovered was that there was a sharp dividing line, despite the fact there is no visible natural barrier. So that was Wallace's discovery, and it's still known after him today. He thought that it was probably the result of sunken continents. There used to be 2 supercontinents, a super Australia and a super Asia, and they'd sunk. And the islands of Indonesia are the fragmented remains. And that explained why the species were so unrelated on either side. But we now know it's plate tectonics, which Wallace couldn't have known, but that Australia has come all the way around from South America and crunched up against Australia. And that's why such unbelievably unrelated creatures are right next to each other, and that one can, in fact, draw a line. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
I understand that, and again, it may be myth, so you're good at myth busting, but I understand that finally Darwin agonized and wrote Descent of Man, but my understanding is that Wallace could never bring himself to apply evolutionary theory to man. Am I incorrect in that perception?
Yes, well, Darwin didn't talk about human evolution and the origin of species. Many people think that he did that because he was afraid, but I'm afraid that's a mistake. Darwin didn't do that because the origin of species is about the general process of evolution. It's not about the origin of any one species. Whereas when he published The Descent of Man, yes, that is specifically about human evolution. But by the time he published that, it wasn't such a big deal anymore, because Huxley and a few others had already published things on human descent from other species. So Darwin's book actually wasn't as controversial as it would have been if he had published it earlier on. Wallace, well, we don't really know. He must have believed in some form of human evolution, but he doesn't write much about it. There's one remark in the margin of his copy of The Origin of Species, where Darwin talks about how 2 species are not one descended from the other, but are both descended from a common ancestor. And Wallace writes in the margin, like orangutan and human. So, and he's right. But what you're thinking about is that in 1864, Wallace apparently had some kind of change of opinion, just at the time he became a spiritualist. And he argued that natural selection could not explain what makes us us, what makes us special, our extraordinary intelligence and other unique features of humans. He said natural selection can only produce the bare minimum needed for survival. But I have seen savages living in a state of nature. They don't need all this intelligence. They don't need the cleverness to become Newton. Therefore, natural selection could not have done it. And this is another one of these amazing leaps of logic. Therefore, it was done by a supernatural intelligence, or one might even say a divine designer of some vague sort. I mean, it's not the God of Christianity. It's just a supernatural designer. And that was connected with his belief in spiritualism. So yes, Darwin and Wallace broke sharply over that. They remained friends for life, but Darwin did famously write to Wallace after hearing about this, saying, I hope you have not murdered too completely your own and my child. Natural selection. I think someone back there was asking a question very early on and didn't get a chance, sorry.
I was just pondering when you were explaining about the insects, if we say take an insect and it lives best camouflaged on brown, and then the environment changes, so really the green ones are going to do better. Are you saying Wallace's theory was that the green ones then, as it were, sprang into existence because now they would survive, or that they were there already, and they then started to do a lot better because the green environment was what was needed, or rather than the brown ones, which then became too noticeable and got eaten?
Wallace has the different colored varieties existing before. And that's one thing in his essay that's not explained. You know, it's just a short essay. Not everything that we would like is in it. Now, I've supplied some of this explanation from his notebooks. So he left out of the essay itself how varieties are formed. But people have been arguing about this for decades. What did he mean? You know, how are varieties formed for Wallace? They're just there in the essay. Once in his notebook that he says they're constantly appearing, and that has nothing to do with the environment. They are simply appearing of differing shades and colors, and this happens all the time. And that this is what allows some to survive. But it's not with reference, so in that sense it's random, in the sense that it's not with reference to the environment. His essay is a remarkable twist, because earlier Wallace had been very anti any idea of adaptation. To Wallace, a theory of adaptation smacked of old-fashioned natural theology, that things fit their environment, they fit nature because God made them fit. He hated that. He constantly ridiculed any book or article that argued that. So you should be surprised that then Wallace suddenly came up with a theory of adaptation himself. But it was one, like Darwin, which had no supernatural agency involved. It was a natural, as he said in that letter, remember, I've come up with a theory to explain it naturally.
If, as you say, Darwin said to Wallace, our theories of evolution are the same, did Darwin acknowledge Wallace's contribution in Origin of Species?
Yes.
Should he have done so?
Well, what he should have done is not really a question for a historian to answer. But he mentions Wallace on the first page, saying that I've been prompted to publish this earlier than I expected, because Mr. Wallace is now working in the Malay Archipelago, has come up with views, I think he says identical to mine or virtually the same as mine. And he mentions Wallace later in the volume. And with each succeeding edition of The Origin, Wallace gets mentioned more and more. But it's a matter of evaluation or subjective opinion whether one should mention Wallace more or not. I don't know. Wallace was flattered with the mention he got, and Darwin didn't change that much in other editions. So there was a second part to your question.
Yes, should. In other words, Darwin is credited, as you say, as the result of Origin of Species, with developing the theory. Should he have made a greater acknowledgement of Wallace's contribution so that Darwin himself...
Yeah, I see. Well, in my opinion, I don't see why he should have done any differently than he did. What he was publishing was a condensed version of his 20 years of work. What I forgot to mention is that when Wallace's letter arrived, Darwin isn't just sitting around fumbling his thumbs. He's writing furiously his massive book on his evolutionary theory. Probably would have been 3, maybe 4 volumes. He's only a year away from finishing. He's almost done. And Wallace's letter in the joint reading puts that on hold. So what Darwin publishes is what he's been working on for 20 years, as he tells the readers on the first page. And he says, I'm publishing this now because Mr. Wallace has come up with the same idea. That's what happened. So I don't know whether he should talk about Wallace anymore. I don't know. Because nothing in the book that you're reading comes from Wallace. It's Darwin's work for the last 20 years. But yeah, so one could easily argue, well, he should have talked about Wallace some more. Yeah. In fact, it's often been said that Darwin is not very good at crediting his predecessors or crediting those on whose work he has drawn. But I don't think about those sorts of things because it's a question of ought, and it's hard to attribute what one ought to have done or what somebody ought to have done. I really can't answer that. Yeah.
I wonder how much religion had to do, because it was a fairly heretical thesis that was being proposed. And wasn't the suggestion that Darwin, I mean, he brought it forward, but he was always quite, it was very difficult to actually specifically expose the fact that God had nothing to do with evolution.
Well, no, I wouldn't put it that way. You see, this is one of the biggest inconsistencies in the way we talk about the story of evolutionary science, which is that Darwin published his book, and there was a huge fight, and well, as we know, within 10 or 15 years, the fight was over. And that was it. It was done, with only one book, basically, and some evidence. But nowadays, we have billions of times more evidence, and evolution is considered to be hugely controversial, and that people are still fighting over it. They're not scientists, obviously. But how can that be, that the fight was over in Victorian times with that little bit of evidence they had, and nowadays it's said to be hugely controversial? How can that be? I think it's because the Victorians didn't see it in the way people nowadays tend to, as either or. Because Darwin published his book into a world that was much more religiously conservative, or much more believing than the secular, mostly secular world we live in now. How did that happen? It's because those readers accepted Darwin's theory as true, but didn't consider it as opposed to their religion, necessarily, or they had to choose science or the religion. It was easier for them to accept both. After all, they've been doing this for a long time. There was, of course, the problem of the age of the earth, which had been uncovered by Christian scientists. There was the problem of the fossil record gradually being uncovered and realizing that life on Earth had been around a long time. There were all these eras that were not known in the Bible. All of that discovered by Christian scientists. So people had become accustomed to accommodating and blending their religious and scientific views. And when Darwin's book came out, it was another instance of that. And so Darwin and many people thought of his theory as this is how God makes it work. God made the laws of nature, and nature works perfectly. And God was so clever that he thought of natural selection so that life can begin, and you can imagine a supernatural beginning for it, and then it works according to these laws. And doesn't need to be constantly interfered in. So some people in this debate over Darwin's theory would say that this was a superior view of the Creator, in which he was clever enough to figure it out in the first place, how to make it work by itself, and not have to constantly go in and fill the gaps caused by extinction, which are the result of his own nature. So that's one possibility.
Thank you. It's a very satisfying exposition, based in part on the uncovering all the revelation, to me anyway, of the contemporaneous correspondence. And it's extraordinary, isn't it, that you could still find 3 of the letters that Darwin sent to other naturalists to say, give me skins of chickens or fowl. Are current scientists leaving this kind of evidence trail for the historians of the future? Why were those things preserved, and by whom? And are they being preserved contemporaneously now for the next generation of you?
All of these historic documents that I've mentioned, they're all in well protected in archives such as Cambridge University Library or elsewhere. The reason they survive is that usually the recipient kept them, or someone else preserved them, or sometimes they just got stuck in a book and were there for 100 years when they were found later, and then they were considered old and valuable and were preserved. Whether or not scientists, this will happen today, well, this is a hot topic. Oh, nowadays everything's on email and everything's written in your laptop and there's no paper trail, nothing will survive. And I worry about that. Oh gosh, historians in the future won't have anything. But actually, if you think about it, if you step back a bit, that's actually exactly the same as it's always been, which is to say that almost everything gets lost, and all we're left with are little fragments, a bit like Wallace's Indonesian islands, right? We're left with a few letters, a few notebooks, and a few things. And the job of the historian is to try to extrapolate from those tiny fragments the whole picture. And that's why it's difficult, and that's why we will constantly be arguing about what happened, because the evidence is incomplete. It'll be the same in the future, that, most of the emails will have vanished and so forth, but there will be enough traces in the future. There will be things that got printed out, or there will be some data bank that got well preserved and looked after and so forth. So there will be, but I think it will be just the same, that you'll be left with a fragmentary, incomplete picture of today's science, just like we have of the past.
Good morning. On Saturday at 1 o'clock, James Lovelock is talking to Rosie Boycott, And if I may, I just read briefly the introduction. It says, the visionary Earth scientist suggests two new big ideas. The first is that 300 years ago, when Thomas Newcomen invented the steam engine, he was unknowingly beginning accelerated evolution, a process which is bringing about change on our planet roughly 1 million times faster than Darwinian evolution. The second is that as part of this process, humanity has the capacity to become the intelligent part of Gaia, the self-regulating Earth system whose discovery Lovelock first announced nearly 50 years ago. I wonder if you care to comment on that.
Well, I don't agree with the view that there's such a thing as faster than Darwinian revolution. Evolution. Darwinian evolution doesn't have a rate. It's not a clock. It's simply the change that happens to happen from the differential death and survival of living things, depending on whatever happens in the world. So dramatic volcano eruptions, changes in the atmosphere, ice ages, have all been dramatic events in the history of life which have changed things. And if you want to put it that way, changed the rate at which living things changed, right, or evolved. So there is no constant rate. And whether or not 1 million times faster now, I think that's a rather unreliable figure. How on earth can that possibly be calculated? And which life forms is one talking about? Because if you're talking about bacteria, that's wrong. If you're talking about big mammals, well, maybe that's right, I don't know. So I tend to think that if you take a broader perspective on things, there's actually really nothing new under the sun. If you look at what we already know about the history of life on Earth with many huge extinction events, what about a gigantic asteroid slamming into the Earth and unleashing a giant fireball and blocking out the sun for months on end and killing off all the plants? That's a pretty dramatic, fast event. I think that's a few million times faster than normal evolution and so forth. So, yeah, whatever was going on now is still, I would say, part of the same game. That is that the world changes, the environment changes, living things adapt or they go extinct. And that's all there is as far as evolution is concerned. I think we should go on to someone who hasn't asked another question. But you can talk to me in the book session afterwards. Yes?
I think that after Darwin's death, Wallace really extends to the future his ideas of evolutionary change in society. The emancipation of women, these were not particularly popular ideas. And his scientific reputation really suffered from the enormous amount he wrote about anthropology, change, spiritualism. It wasn't just spiritualism, there were all kinds of other theories about the perfectibility of human beings through the wonderful influence of women, for example. When women no longer had to go for a meal ticket for life, life would change because the inferior men would simply not marry. I mean, he's basically quite speculative, and it's not surprising that Darwin modestly says, well, I can't really go with you there to spiritualism, but I don't think many people would have gone to him on some of his theories of social change.
Yes, you're right. Well, Wallace was a bold social theorist. He also was a prominent leader in the land nationalization movement and many other things. I mean, it's hard not to sympathize with Wallace as an amiable man who is fighting for good against all sorts of social ills and so forth. But it's very difficult to gauge what that does to his scientific reputation. After all, human beings are often engaged in many different kinds of things. Darwin is actually a bit unusual in the sense that he's rather narrow and that he only writes about science and nothing else, because his interests are much narrower than Wallace's.